So this is going to be another one of the big man permutations, and I'm titling this big man permutation um, simple space-time travel communication coordinate set. That's to simply identify which set this number 36-3 belongs to, not the complex smart space-time travel communication coordinate set, but the simple space-time travel communication coordinate set. And the reason that I'm identifying it as the simple space-time travel communication coordinate set and not merely space-time travel communication coordinate number 36-3 is because within the context of those numbers below 40, typically the coordinates, right, refer to the complex set of space-time travel communication coordinates, which only has 40 items in it rather than the 360 items that belong to the simple space-time travel communication coordinate set. So to to limit any confusion, although I'm not necessarily against confusion generally, but to limit any confusion about which space-time travel communication coordinate set this number 36-6 belongs to, I've identified it as such and specified that it does belong to the simple space-time travel communication coordinate set of 360 items that also belongs to the conceptual construct of the 360 degrees of a circle, and therefore, in any number, any possible number, well, I should say any possible counting number, right, greater or less than 0 can be situated in this set, although I think I've mentioned before that if that number is too great, I probably won't do the work and divide it by 360, more than I don't know how many times exactly. I hate to specify a number of times, but I'm certainly not going to figure out how many 360s, a number like 24 billion 362,574 0.4 would represent. So given that, the idea of infinitude is represented in the 360-degree circle, which can be subtracted from 0 or added to 0. However, in all practical applications of space-time travel communication coordinate set, the simple one, we'll limit ourselves to those numbers that are readily recognizable as multiples of 360. So this piece, I thought I should say something about the big man permutations, as many of you who are keeping up with the channel will recall, began in some way as a response to my neighbor Karen, who after the big storm that we had, the big hail and rainstorm that we had a couple of weeks ago, called the police because I was cleaning out the storm drains, and apparently in the process of doing so, I placed my foot on his property. And this is, of course, the same neighbor who was destroying a wall that belongs to my property with his sprinkler system, but refused to do anything about it. And so there's a certain amount of irony in the lack of sort of equilateral, concern, but But the big man permutations began, I suppose, out of a statement that my neighbor Karen made. Um, I'm not really sure where it came from, but as I was, cleaning up and explaining the need to clean out the storm drains because a lot of debris, had been, clogging them, he made a statement that I was not a big man, and I think we've discussed like the way that this might be, some kind of a projection. But then after, I was informed that I was not a big man, then he called the police again. I think this is the third time that he called the police, and I can't remember all of the rationales or occasions on which this person has called the police, but I believe the number of those phone calls is 3 at this point. I mean, I expect there will be more. There's like all kinds of things that one could do that would disturb Karen. So they began with that and playing with this idea of like what the big man might mean. And this piece that I want to do today, that I'm doing this long introduction for, it may not be completely obvious that each one of the lines for this piece is in fact a story or really a narrative. And in my former teacher David Anton's sense of the term narrative, his distinction between narrative as a psychological event that challenges one's sense of identity or tests one's sense of identity, or establishes a relationship between self, right, and either moment or series of events in the experience of that experiencing subject. So these will all be narratives, but the narratives behind them won't be so obvious. So I thought what I would do is make a list of the kinds of big man that I'm not. And so the basic structure will be the iterative expression I am not a big man, but between the word big, between the adjective big and the noun man, I will put a list of both places that I have attempted employment, and places that I have attempted to be a consumer. And there will be other things that go in there too, but that's the basic idea. Places where you frequent, right? Either and that could include like a public library. There will be in fact a public library in there, and then there will be places that I've attended school, and all of these places that I will fit between the adjective big and the noun man will be places where I've had a problem, either retaining employment or acquiring, service because of this continuum that I have that sometimes is recognized as a learning disability, but I prefer to think of as cognitive difference. But that includes dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. And sometimes these narratives will be, complex and simple, but I'm not going to tell the stories. I'm just going to identify those, sort of experiential loci. And so there will be narratives behind each one of these lines, but the narratives, won't be revealed for the most part. I'll reveal a couple of them to describe the difference between what I would call a simple and a complex narrative. And that in some way relates to the difference between the simple and the complex space-time travel communication coordinate sets as well. So a simple one will be, something like one of the first jobs I had, I believe it was the second job I ever had. I must have been about 15 years old, maybe 16. And it was at a McDonald's in Encinitas, California. And because of my dyscalculia, I had a hard time giving the customers to this store the exact correct amount of change. So my drawers were typically off by a few cents or by a couple of dollars, and the manager had difficulty with this, and so I was fired from that job. That's a simple example of an experience, right, of attempting to have employment with this cognitive difference, and there being a lack of allowances for a situation in which my employment would be tolerated. A more complex one would be, for example, I purchased insurance for my home and my car when I lived in Julian, California, from a State Farm agent. And I explained at the time that I purchased it that I was transferring my insurance because the company that I had been using before that, weren't particularly helpful in interpreting and helping me fill out paperwork for these various applications and sets of information that I had to provide to the insurance company. So I specified when I purchased the insurance that I would need help filling out paperwork, and they were at that time when I purchased the insurance, they were happy to agree to those conditions. And then I was driving in the town of Julian, and it was sometime near Christmas, and sometime in the Christmas season, and it was really, really busy. The streets were crowded on both sides, and traffic was stopped. There was no way of getting out of traffic or proceeding in traffic, and I guess there was a fire somewhere or an emergency, and the local fire department was called, and a fire truck came through, and the roads were all blocked, so everybody had to try to figure out a way to get out of the way of the fire engine, the fire truck, and I did, and in the process of doing so, I did get out of the way so that the fire truck could proceed, which I was pretty proud of, but because it wasn't that easy. But in the process of doing so, I nicked somebody's car. So, excuse me. So, there was a claim, and then I got in touch with the insurance company, and it turned out that because the claim, was made over a certain amount of money, that there was a lot of paperwork to fill out, send to the DMV, and et cetera, et cetera. So I went down to the State Farm agent, and I requested help filling out the paperwork, and the State Farm agent, not only, refused at that point, to help me, but, wanted to lecture me on how that wasn't part of the duties of the office. And then I tried to explain as, reasonably as I could, like, that we had this discussion, or, maybe it was with someone else that I had the discussion when I purchased the insurance, but I had this discussion, and I informed them at that time that I had these limitations and that I might require help, and they agreed to that, and that was the very reason that I chose, to buy this particular insurance from this particular agency. Okay, so anyway, it was just one of those dead ends in the conversation where, no, sorry, like, whatever we promised you, we weren't allowed to promise you that, and we're not going to fulfill the terms of that promise. So then at that point, I refused to leave the office until, I had assistance, because I felt that was part of my contract with them. And so to get me to leave, they called the police. So, again, that kind of ties into the whole, the Karen thing going on here. The other Karen, who told me that I was, reminded me, I guess, that I'm not a big man. So at that point, I did leave because, well, the main reason, was because, I had dogs at home. I had, a pack of rescued res dogs waiting for me at home, and I didn't know what was going to happen to them if I was arrested for, trying to get the State Farm, insurance agent to fulfill the terms of what I felt was a verbal contract that we had when I bought the insurance. So, worried about the dogs, I abruptly left. And then after I left, I received a letter from the State Farm office that I was, not allowed to come back to the office, and that I was banned from the office, and then they had switched my policy to I don't even remember where, like, some agent in Chicago or something. This was, I lived in California. So, I called the company, and I, complained, and nothing ever really changed. I talked to various people on upper echelons of State Farm, but the only thing I ever received, I never received an apology or reimbursement, for my wasted time and, effort, or anything. The only thing I ever received was a lot of, like, forms asking me, after after nothing happened, with my complaints, like how great the service was, right? And of course it wasn't great at all. And so, like, why would I bother, filling out these evaluation forms? So, well, this is a complex narrative, right? This is a complex narrative, but it still involves, like, the same issues, like the same continuum of, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. Another complex narrative is, my experience at the University of California at San Diego, which I attended, and I received a BA there. So I have a degree in English and American literature from the University of California. But it took me 8 years to get it for various reasons. I had to find classes that didn't have Scantron tests. I had to kind of jump in the water and see if it was water that I could swim in, or if it was, too turbulent. So I often started a course and then would have to, abandon it because the requirements for the particular course were beyond my abilities. And oddly, it was often the lower division classes that I had problems with, because they were more likely to have a higher number of in-class examinations where writing by hand was required as opposed to typing, and they were more likely to have, things like multiple choice tests, which I had, real difficulty with. So, that was part of, like, this. I'm calling this a complex, narrative, because it wasn't just about, finding, the classes that I was able to survive, right? That took me the 8 years, but it involved a number of other things too. Like, I think I've told the story about how I figured out ways to fill out, these little blue books that we had that you were supposed to complete your in-class responses to in finals and midterms, right? Like, by anticipating the question, and then that's called cheating, right? So this is a complex story of survival by experimentation, cheating, and other strategies, like that one learns when one doesn't have recourse to assistive technology or accommodations, which now, of course, there are much more of. But in the real world, there still are not, right? So at one point at UCSD, I received two letters. One letter saying that I was going to be kicked, as the kind of irony of it, kicked out because I hadn't taken enough of the required lower division classes. And then I think a day or two after, I received a letter saying that I was going to be kicked out because I had been there too long. So you've done too much and too little both at the same time. Then that's a complex narrative. And then another example of a simple narrative, but one that I think is somewhat relevant because it demonstrates the fact that this stuff continues to happen. It's not something that belongs to the historic past, right? So the other day I was in need of a haircut, and I've gotten haircuts from this place here in Albuquerque that is on Central Avenue, right across from the university, called Campus Barber, right? Campus Barber or Campus Hairstyle or something like that. And I've gotten haircuts there a couple of times just as a walk-in. And I guess, during the summertime in particular, there's not a lot of students around, so the walking in is pretty easy. And I tried to get a haircut the other day, and then I was informed, well, you can wait, but it's going to be about a 2-hour wait. And I said, well, can I make an appointment then? And for next week and get a haircut. And the person that I talked to said yes, and you can do that online, and you got to put in this number and this number, and all these other numbers, and and then you'll have this appointment, and you can come in and get your hair cut. Well, I tried to explain that, like putting all those numbers in and like attempting to figure out like this particular thing, and this particular code problem for me, right? Like, wasn't really something that I could do. And then I mentioned that I had this sort of dyslexia, dyscalculia thing, and could I, since I was just there, I was present there, personally in that moment, just make an appointment, either then or later, person to person. And no, I was informed no, that the only way that they make appointments is using this computer system that they have. And so I didn't really bother to tell them that it was discrimination, because I didn't want to get into it, and I didn't want them to call the police. And that sounds ridiculous, but you'd be surprised how many times when you let someone know that they have a policy that is discriminatory, they so don't want to hear it that they find a way of removing you by force. So that's another example of what I would refer to as a simple narrative, right? The simple story that could have become a more complex story had I, argued the point, right? It could have turned into a larger Karen situation had I argued the point and pointed out, like, the discrimination that, the sort of unwoke, right? Like, discriminatory lack of self-understanding, right? And this is why people hate that word woke, right? Because like they don't want to have to deal with like all of the stuff that they do that is unfair and discriminatory and awful. That rather just stay asleep.
I am not a big reading circle man. I am not a big phonics learning man. I am not a big proper spelling man. I am not a big decipherable handwriting man. I am not a big telephone number recollection man. I am not a big magnanimous to name-calling man. I am not a big indifferent to suffering man. I am not a big McDonald's fast food cashier man. I am not a big high school algebra man. I am not a big high school physics man. I am not a big advanced placement in biology test man. I am not a big pre-SAT man. I am not a big Department of Motor Vehicles multiple choice test man. I am not a big Finnegan's Wake reading marathon man. I am not a big scholastic aptitude testing man. I am not a big American college testing services man. I am not a big cassette tape transcription man. I am not a big college application man. I am not a big Scantron style test taking man. I am not a big in-class writing examination man. I am not a big county courthouse paperwork completion man. I am not a big syllable counting man. I am not a big college algebra man. I am not a big probability calculus man. I'm not a big quick reading man. I'm not a big voting booth man. I'm not a big banking account balance man. I'm not a big time management man. I'm not a big graduate records examination man. I'm not a big backwards signature forging man. I'm not a big graduate school application man. I'm not a big multiple language learning man. I'm not a big car mileage record keeping man. I'm not a big numerical value recollection man. I'm not a big tidy job application man. I'm not a big spelling error free frameworks listserv man. I'm not a big password and code remembering man. I'm not a big literary publication man. I'm not a big grant application man. I'm not a big social service case note taking man. I'm not a big tribal TANF paperwork man. I'm not a big job services resource room man. I'm not a big multi-lot property tax paying man. I'm not a big online bill paying man. I'm not a big state farm insurance form man. I'm not a big Julian public library man. I'm not a big Smith's grocery store man. I'm not a big campus barber haircut man. I'm not a big magnanimous to name calling man.